Will Tregoning, welcome into the weeds, brother. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Mate, you're a bright spark. I was reading up on you.
I was worried about that.
Yes, yeah. I've been doing all my research. You're a really bright spark. You've got a PhD in Cultural Studies from Sydney Uni, a Bachelor of Arts for your sins, and you're one of the leading advocates in Australia on drug law reform. You're the CEO of Unharm, a drug law reform NGO. You started yourself. You're an overachiever. But why drug law reform? What was it that made you pick this area of social policy and law to really get involved in?
Yeah, it's a good question. I made a decision at a certain point in my career when I was working in research that I wanted to do more purposeful work, and looked around and saw drug law reform as something that I cared about, where it didn't seem that a great deal was happening. Or at least I thought that I could contribute a lot relative to the scale of what was going on in order to make a difference to society, I suppose. But the pathway to getting involved in this work started a long time before that. I grew up here in Sydney, a very privileged kind of upbringing on Sydney's leafy North Shore.
Avalon.
Neutral Bay.
Neutral Bay.
Same sort of thing.
Was it Neutral Bay? I thought it was Avalon, but the Neutral
That's
Bay.
That's a bit cooler.
Avalon is.
Well, it is nowadays.
It is nowadays.
Neutral Bay is not cool. It's a nice place, but it's not cool. Anyway, grew up there and, educated the expensive way, went to St. Ignatius College, the school of Barnaby Joyce and Tony Abbott and other illustrious political figures. And, drug use wasn't part of my life as a young person. I was a very studious kind of kid. But when I left school, the nightclub scene, house and techno were a huge part of my life. And I used MDMA in those contexts and had generally a really good time. And this isn't a story about like running into problems with drugs. My experience wasn't that. It was a primarily positive experience. And the thing that most struck me about those times and that experience was how frequently I bumped into people that I'd been to school with in the bars and clubs of Sydney, clearly high on MDMA or cocaine or whatever it might be. And I thought, oh shit, like all these rich kids use drugs. And it was totally different from the expectation that I'd had growing up, which was that drug use was like a fringe phenomenon or a kind of grungy, maybe if you listen to Nirvana or I don't know, I had...
Or something that you did if your life was falling apart. And,
yeah, exactly. And what I actually observed was something completely different from that. Here were the sons of major financial figures or big rural families, members of the rowing first aid, off chops on pills. And that really struck me, And then later on, after I spent a long time at university, I started working as a researcher, a consultant to government departments and agencies. And most of that was in health. We did a lot of work about drug and alcohol policy. And I'd very often be sitting in these meetings in government departments, talking to bureaucrats about programs we were evaluating or research that we were doing for campaigns about, safer alcohol use or other, cannabis or whatever it might be. And I noticed how whenever they talked about drug use, they always talked about it as if it was just something that went on out there in society, like not like any of us would do that. It wasn't spoken explicitly, but that was definitely the implication, It's just something other people do. And
that was at the fringes. It wasn't pervasive.
Exactly.
It wasn't. Essentially, everyone's taking some form of drug in some way.
Well, exactly. And, being a researcher, I'd seen the data by this point. The National Drug Strategy Household Survey has very detailed data about who uses drugs and how many.
Tell us, what is that? Because that's a pretty comprehensive body of work that comes around again and again and again.
It does.
And it really should inform us on who we are and what we do and what we take.
For sure, yeah. I mean, I think 20,000 people complete that survey every 3 years at the moment. One of the things that when I really dug into the data really struck me was that if you are employed, you're more likely to have used drugs in your lifetime than a person who's unemployed. The same
really
goes
fascinating.
If you've got a tertiary degree, you're more likely to have used drugs than a person who doesn't have a tertiary degree. And these are kind of counter to the stereotype of drug use that we hear about very often. And at the same time, you know, sitting in these meetings with bureaucrats who definitely were at the more privileged end of the spectrum, mostly had tertiary education degrees, I just look around and think, come on, like, you guys are bullshitting. And there we were designing government policy and programs. And I just was struck by the fact that there's this culture of dishonesty about drug use right at that place where we were meant to be designing and, you know, evaluating supposedly evidence-based policy. So that really influenced me as well. But it was then moving to King's Cross, which I did 15, 16 years ago here in Sydney, and seeing who actually gets targeted for law enforcement. I mean, I knew that it wasn't people like me, but living in the Cross, especially at that time, when it was a much busier place, the centre of the Sydney nightlife scene, but also an important place in the Sydney heroin scene. And so there was street-based selling and injecting and whatnot. And so intense police activity. And I noticed I'm basically invisible in King's Cross, like a white guy in a suit or whatever. The police don't even see me. But it was people experiencing homelessness, people with obvious signs of poverty or mental illness, and Aboriginal people who time and time again I'd see stopped and searched by the police for drugs. And there was one moment that really stuck with me, which was walking past McDonald's with hundreds of other people, you know, King's Cross McDonald's right there on the strip, busy part, central King's Cross, but a 9 o'clock on a Monday morning kind of thing. All these people off to work in suits and ties, streaming past this scene where there's a man, clearly a man without a house, sitting on the street with all his possessions spread in front of him like a fan, covering the whole bloody pavement with these two big burly cops standing over him, searching all his stuff, looking for drugs. And I just thought, I can't walk past that anymore. The fact that people like me basically have more ability to actually contribute to changing the situation. And at the same time, we don't really we're not at the pointy end of all the harms that come from criminalisation. You know, if you've got privilege, if you do end up being caught by the cops, you get a barrister and they get you off on a Section 10 or whatever it might be. If you run into problems with dependent drug use, you can afford to go to rehab, etc. I mean, even the fact of having a home means that you've got a barrier against, you know, a privacy, that you have privacy in your drug use, so that then you're much less likely to be stopped by the cops. And of course, being older is the same sort of thing. You're more likely to have a place where you can use drugs privately, whereas young people don't have that ability. And so they too tend to be the kinds of people constantly stopped and searched by police. So it was seeing all those things that just made me think, I've got to do something about this and make a contribution to actually changing the law in this area. So
it was drug policy based on stigma in one hand, cliches, not based on data, and then enforcement based on, again, on discrimination, targeting people on the basis of age, race, class, wealth, and etc. So
yeah,
you got angry about it. You got active, and in 2014, I think you and Miles, didn't you?
That's right. Yeah,
Miles Hunt, who's our lead Senate candidate for the upcoming federal election here in New South Wales. Good on you, Miles. You did something about it. Like, did you quit your job? What did you do? How did you go from that moment out there on the cross to starting Unharm?
Yeah, well, to be honest, the first years were really hard. We didn't really have any access to funding, you know, and so a lot of it was volunteer based. I was a volunteer. Everyone who did work in the organisation was a volunteer, and so we started. Like, first of all, one of the things that I wanted to do was find a language to actually talk to members of the public, people whom I knew, about the need for reform in a way that actually made sense to them and was powerful and persuasive. I felt like I didn't have that. And I was really interested. I've been thinking and reading about the issue a lot. But even when I tried to speak to family and friends about it, I could see and they could tell the points weren't quite landing. And so a lot of that initial work was talking with people who had already been working in this space to understand the issues, but also to get a sense of how we could actually tell persuasive stories to the general public about the need for change in a way that actually resonated with them and made sense. in addition to that, like a lot of that early work was about what we did a lot of community organizing here in Sydney. And, essentially that was like a kind of consultation where people who were interested in the issue showed up and in various ways contributed to building what Unharm became. And one of the things that came through really clearly in that early work was that people who use drugs wanted to actually be able to speak about that more honestly in a way that, would have an impact on their personal life, in that they wouldn't have to have that shame or silence around their own drug use. But also so that, like, especially people who had a bit more social privilege could contribute to removing some of the dishonesty around drug use, which I think is like one of the major things that holds the current system in place. And
because there's so much judgment in this space, isn't there? You're doing drugs because something's gone wrong. So there's all this stigma, there's all this the pearl clutching about it, and so there's not an honest discussion.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of drawing the veil back of the diversity of drug use. Different people use different drugs for different reasons.
Absolutely.
And it's not just a catch-all of people who are using drugs because something's gone wrong or there's some dysfunction. There's a that's part of it, but there's a much bigger, more complex conversation to be had.
Absolutely. I mean, the reason why people keep using drugs is because they're solving a problem for them, and that might be that you have some challenging experience of trauma in your life, and that solution might not necessarily be a long-term and positive solution for you, but it might in the moment actually take the pain away. For other people, it's just about taking them from a state where they are to where they want to be, which might be, and in very many cases, is positive. That's why people keep using drugs for the most part, because they start because they're curious and they continue because they like it, or they discontinue because they don't like it. And of course, most people do discontinue for using illegal drugs for one reason or another, and the main one is just aging out and having other things come up in your life, and that's
aging out. It sounds so terrible.
It does.
I've aged out.
It does, but people in their 20s are the people who are most likely to use drugs in any given year, and
they're curious. They're curious. They're curious.
They've got more time.
They've got more time. They've got disposable income.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily,
these
but
days,
they don't have the responsibilities, and they're more likely to say, look, there's some risk involved in this. I'm procuring these drugs from the street, or, they're from the black market. Yeah. They're prepared to take a risk.
Yeah. And so, when you hear, as you sometimes do, politicians or other influential figures talk about drug use and addiction as if they were the same thing, it's just so blatantly misrepresenting the reality, where most drug use is voluntary, primarily positive, and a minor part of people's life. But, I was really pushed by some of that early work we did with the community. And when I say community, it was largely here because we only had really access to or ability to organize here in Sydney. And so it was a lot of work talking with people, primarily people with their own lived experience of drug use of a variety of forms. And like I said, that message about the need to actually be honest about your own drug use came through really strongly. But that was a lesson I had to learn the hard way, in that I came from a background where I'd done a lot of work in communications, consulting, and that kind of thing, like advising government on advertising campaigns, including things about road safety or whatever it might be. And I knew that facts don't change people's minds, that you can't just come out with like a bullet point list of here's like some statistics and expect people to have the scales fall away and agree with you, but that in fact personal stories or a narrative that actually connects with people's own values and comes from a messenger whom that they can identify with or respect to some extent is what actually persuades and shifts people's attitudes. So I knew that theoretically, but then very early on, I found myself in an interview where I was asked about my own drug use. And this was a time when I hadn't really even considered about whether I wanted to make that part of my public persona, and also hadn't had any media training. And look, I looked like a dill, and it all went to air, right? So I ummed and ahed as the journalist sat there, waiting for me to decide whether or not I was going to open up about my own drug use in the interview. Eventually I said, no, I'm not. And then that night I was thinking about it, and I thought, well, what am I doing? Am I real about this thing or not? Like the whole thing that had motivated me to get involved was observing that dishonesty, and also observing that people like me are not getting the sharp end of the stick from the current system. So I think there's more responsibility on a person like me to be open about it. So anyway, had that whole kind of self chat, and then texted the journalist and said, you know what, I've got to do this. Like, can we re-record?
Oh, it wasn't live.
It wasn't. No, it was like a pre-record package for a TV show on SBS. So she came back the next day and we recorded a second segment where I was open, and I said, much like I've been today, spoke about my experience with drugs and that kind of thing.
And for a lot of people who are going to watch this, they're going to say that's not surprising, but it wasn't that long ago that this was groundbreaking. That people who were functional in their personal and private and their professional lives were prepared to say it was. They were prepared to say, I've done drugs. I probably will do drugs again.
It's still pretty rare, I would say.
I mean, look at how Albo responded, where he's famous for, knocking back a few bongs at uni and all the rest of it. And yet when he's asked, he sort of he said, I think he actually said, I plead the fifth. I don't want to incriminate myself. Right. So there's an implicit acknowledgement that, yes, I did drugs at uni, but he's not prepared to say yes and...
Exactly.
to shoot down all the stigma and discrimination that comes along with it.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen a few good examples of politicians being more open, like Jacinta Allen and Tim Pallas in Victoria recently, especially Tim being more open about his own cannabis use, and MPs like Kate Fairman here in New South Wales, among a couple of others. But it's still, I think, not a common thing. And we have... Now, in Unharm, we do a lot of work supporting people to share personal narrative. And so that's made me think a lot more about the risks and how to support people in managing the risks. And the risks are still real, especially for people who are younger, who tend to be the ones more likely to be using drugs. But there are also people at an early part of their career who don't have the clout to be able, I think, to be confident about defending themselves in a work situation if it did become an issue. And so, it and also, of course, many other things, like what happens when my family watches the footage and all that kind of thing.
Miles' story is remarkable.
Yeah.
He was into the deep end and then dealing with the consequences and going, hey, this might cost me my career and I've got to tell mum, I'm going to be in the Sydney Morning Herald tomorrow.
Yeah. And
so really courageous.
Yeah, and I think that helped me be courageous too. I think we were kind of, Miles comes from a similar sort of background, and I think had that same sort of sense that he had an ability to contribute, given the kind of privilege he grew up with as well. And I think in those early days, we were kind of geeing each other up a little bit about being more daring or confident about doing that, because we believed that it was really important. And I have no regrets. But
so you're working on the narrative. You're building up the courage to get out there. But you had to build an organisation. You had to build a structure around that, and you're a volunteer-based organisation. Tell us how you actually. Why did you settle on the word Unharm, and how did you bring allies in to the organisation back then in the early days?
So Unharm is about transforming a harmful system into one that actually promotes well-being. Our laws are hugely harm-creating, like what we've been talking about. They're essentially just aimed at people who are already marginalised, and they just exacerbate disadvantage. That's
a really interesting point. I've got to stop you there. It's not just it's not just about reducing or the harm associated with drugs. It's about reducing the harm perpetuated by the system.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the whole people definitely experience problems related to drug use, right? There's no doubt about that. And at the same time, the idea that the only harms that we need to care about are the ones that are caused by drugs themselves is just a massive kind of free pass to politicians to oversee a system that is hugely harm creating, both in terms of law enforcement, right? In the way, like I was just saying, that it's aimed at people already on the margins, but it's more than that. It's that a lot of the things that contribute to people having problems with drugs are things like poverty and disadvantage, the lack of opportunity. For example, living in a town where there aren't many jobs, or growing up with an experience of trauma because you grew up in unstable housing, all these kinds of things, right? There's a clear link between that and problematic use of drugs. And blaming it all on the drugs, I think, is just a way for then people to wash their hands of the responsibility to actually
I think
address some
I
of
think
that.
this is the key point, that the drugs are the easy target for politicians. They say, look, these problems are caused by the drugs. In actual fact, the drugs have become problematic because of all these other things that politicians and policymakers and bureaucrats just can't have failed to deal with.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, one of the examples where we saw that was back in 2017, the federal government, the then Liberal federal government, tried to introduce drug testing for people on the welfare system so that they could kick people off welfare if they were found to be using illegal drugs. And to me, that was an attempt to basically tar all people seeking, you know, on the job seeker system with the brush of being themselves responsible for being unemployed because they're just a bunch of druggos. You know, that was kind of the implicit message. And in fact, the Australian, when this was part of the budget package and it was the massive, like all caps headline on the Australian's front page, something like, you know, essentially saying dole bludgers will be kicked off job seeker if they're using drugs. And I think that that's like an example of how drugs are used to basically essentially discredit people who don't have a lot of money and to make them responsible for their own situation, yet so that then politicians can wash their hands of them and go on basically concentrating wealth among the few.
It's amazing when you actually do a deep dive into drug policy and the history of it. Drugs have been a real wedge that politicians have used again and again and again against minorities, vulnerable cohorts of people in our society, be it the gay community, Indigenous communities, environmentalists, communists, whoever it is, these voices, the disadvantaged, you know, the poor. The drugs have been a straw man that these policymakers and politicians raise up to attack for political gain. And really, it's just, you know, the political class bullying, and in a sense, I think that they benefit from perpetuating a failed system. It gives them something. It gives them something to go and kick every time they need to be shown to be tough on something, rather than solve the problems, which, you know, a rational approach that you and your organisation really are talking about.
Yeah, and I mean, without going too deep on the history, I think that's absolutely right. You know, from the start, it was colonialism that basically threw up the problem of people who use drugs other than alcohol and brought them into contact with, you know, predominantly European-based colonizers who then used that as a pretext to basically control populations because they use the wrong kind of drugs. But then more recently, like you say, it's a way of looking tough for governments. It's quite convenient, and I think we saw in, you know, especially in US politics through the 70s and 80s, how it was used to basically show that government was a tough institution that was doing stuff at a time when a lot of the impetus, especially of some kind of like right politics, was to reduce the role of government, to make it less and less. And so it was like, we're still tough and effective because we're in a war, you know, we're in a war against drug use. At the same time as like these efforts to kind of hollow out the more social service oriented aspects of government.
It is a really fascinating point that you raise. So you're up against it. You're up against a powerful organisations, the governments, the bureaucracies behind them. They're well established. They've got this long tradition, but you've been really effective in just a decade with others, of course, Harm Reduction Australia and all the other groups out there, rational players, at pulling apart these failed policies. But you needed to generate some allies. So how did you get up off the ground? Because you're not funded by government, are you?
Not at all, no. And that's always been the case. We've not received any government funding, and that's essential really to do what we do, which is to basically fearlessly advocate for reform. And you can only do that if you're not tied to government for your income. And I think then in fact that it's the fact that many of the organizations in this space who are involved on the service provider side and so are at the coalface of seeing how harmful the current legal system is, are also relying on government for funding. And so we came in to offer something unique in that independence from government and an ability to be a bit more forthright and fearless, I suppose, in how we do the, how we advocate for change.
I saw that in the recent drug summit. You had all these people who were working for organisations that are dependent on grants, or they're actually working directly as public servants, sort of speaking up, but you could see them sort of stepping, from one stone to the other, going, I need to really navigate a fine line here. It's a razor's edge I'm on, because if I go too hard and fast, we might lose our grant funding.
Right.
They don't want to bite the hand that feeds them. So the work that you do is super essential.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and look, we only were able to kind of to do the work in the way that we do it now. That really only started around 2018. Honestly, but prior to that point, I was almost ready to walk away, because I couldn't see a pathway to building an organization that could have an impact. The problem we're trying to deal with is huge. So to build an organization that can have an impact at the scale that we needed to in order to really make meaningful change in this space. And so it was just in that context that we received an invitation from a social change accelerator program called Progress Labs to take Unharm through the process of stepping back from the work and just thinking about the strategy, about how to build the organization and how to connect with philanthropists. And that was transformational. And it was through that process that we also connected with our foundational funder and Vasudhara Foundation, who've just been, without whom I wouldn't be here. None of this would have happened. We wouldn't have, I believe, pill testing up and down the East Coast without the kind of visionary philanthropy that they brought to this space. And it was from there that we actually began to grow an organization that had real capacity to run and then win campaigns. And honestly, that was a long, long path. There's so much work involved in establishing an organization, getting the right board in place, setting up all your governance structure. I won't go into all that in detail, but there's like a lot of graft that just goes into like creating the envelope, I suppose. And so that started in earnest like in 2018. And funny thing about that year, which almost killed me, is that it was the same year that for separate reasons I'd set in motion a separate organization called the Loop Australia.
Pill testing focused?
Exactly. To be a pill testing service provider, having observed that it was all very well to be campaigning for pill testing, but unless there were organizations that were actually able to deliver the service, then it was it was hard to see how we would actually get to services being
and that
implemented.
was building a group who could go to policymakers, go to politicians and say, this is the mechanics, this is actually how we do these things. It's not just a concept. We can deliver this on the ground. We've thought about the whole process all the way through.
That's right, yeah.
Here, lay it out for these politicians who really didn't want to turn their attention to it.
Yeah, for sure. And also just, there's an immense amount of work that has been involved in actually delivering that kind of service. It's complicated. You've got chemists, health workers and researchers delivering, all having to share data, analyze samples, bring people in, have conversations with them. Getting the service to operate in a way that's really good for people who are coming to participate, as well as, all the risk management. My God, risk management for days was a huge task. So that happened in the same year. Basically, by coincidence, I'd met Professor Fiona Measham, who had started the Loop in the UK. And she was here in Australia on a study tour. She's a criminologist, but also, I guess an entrepreneur in the charity space in terms of setting up drug checking in the UK as well. And she just stayed with me at my place for a few weeks while she was on a study tour, stayed in our spare bedroom. And by the end of it, after a long series of chats, we sort of hatched this plan in the kitchen, like, well, why don't we start the Loop Australia? And it seemed quite easy at the time, nothing like that burst of optimism at the start of like starting an organization. But so that process was then in train. And so it was in 2018 that basically both the Unharm was going through this rebirth, I suppose, and then the Loop being birthed at the same time. And an intensive year, but looking back, I've got no regrets. But it was only really, having that ability to bring in new supporters through that program, Progress Labs, that then has put us on the pathway to where we are today. Because you can't run campaigns. Unfortunately, the reality is you can't run campaigns in the way that we do without money. It's a hugely labour intense. I mean, the main cost is labour. Having people like smart, effective campaigners able to actually dedicate their time just to making this change happen. And then on top of that, research. We actually do research. My background's in research, and so that's been a big part of what we do. Actually doing polling and depth interviews with members of the public to understand how they see drugs or cannabis and drug law reform and all that kind of thing, and using that to inform our campaign strategy and our messaging.
But also create a robust argument so that when you have bureaucrats or your opposition push back, you can say, hold on, this is based on the evidence. And because journalists, those people are going to go through what you're saying with a fine-tooth comb. You've got opposition, people who don't want this change. They're going to look for a chink in that armour and tear it down. So you've got to make sure it's got integrity.
Definitely. Yeah. So obviously there's a lot of, that costs money too. And as does advertising. We need to be able to get our message out in front of people. And so all these things mean that the only way that we can do the work that we do is with the support of philanthropists who've really been like partners for this process. And we've just been fortunate to be able to build some really good relationships with people who also want to see change in this area and have the capacity to, contribute at the level that we need. Of course, Unharm, in my view, is still a very small organisation relative to what we're trying to do. And that's why we've been very focused in New South Wales in the last couple of years. It's just because we want to put the attention where we can have an impact rather than spread too wide. But definitely, growing the organisation, especially in order to legalise cannabis. I mean, that's going to be an increasing part of our work, and I can see that in order to do that, we need to run in multiple states simultaneously. So,
well, it's smart picking New South Wales, as I was saying in politics. In Australian politics, as New South Wales goes, so goes the country. It's a conservative state, but it's also a big state. It's where the media market is.
Yeah.
And if 2018 was a tough year of growth and formation, we're not a million miles away from that. We're 6 years later, 7 years later, and we've got drug checking up and running. What's happening now across? There's some pushback in Queensland, but we've had breakthroughs in Victoria and New South Wales. Walk us through how we got there and what actually is up and running in across the East Coast states.
Yeah, well, I mean, that has been an exciting story and a huge credit to the huge number of people who've put immense amounts of effort into making pill testing happen. And it's just,
you've run petitions, you've done events, every time that there's been some data that you can grab onto, you've been persistent, and you haven't run 1,000 campaigns, really, have you? You've targeted 3 or 4 key campaigns. Drug checking, pill testing was a key one.
Yeah, there's the campaign side, and then, of course, with the Loop, which I'm not involved in the operations team anymore. I chair the board and I support the CEO, but I can't take credit for what they're doing. There's a huge team there who's actually involved in delivering the service. And it's been brilliant to see that journey, right? From essentially my kitchen to the fact that the Loop's now delivering, there'll be a Pitch Music Festival next weekend in Victoria, and that's one of a dozen festivals they're doing in Victoria this year. And in addition to that, they're opening a fixed site service, a community service in Melbourne, where people will be able to go many if not most, maybe every day of the week in order to get their drugs checked. So this is a huge kind of, it's been a tough journey, but like a huge achievement for the team, I think. And it did require immense amounts of campaigning, sustained campaigning over a long period of time. But in terms of where we're at right now, starting from the top, Queensland's in a bit of trouble. It's had a service running there for about 12 months, and that's in Brisbane, in Brisbane, and there's been a service running in the Gold Coast. Each of those is 1 day a week, and then also at a few festivals across the past 12 months. Now, that was a Labor government initiative. of course, the government in Victoria's changed. We've got an LNP government, and they've
In
just
Queensland, sorry.
Sorry, what did I say?
You said Victoria.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I flipped around.
Yeah, in Queensland, Pseudo's come in, and one of the first things he said is he's pulling it down, you know.
Right, Crucifali in Queensland.
Crucifali.
Now we're all mixed
Now
up.
we're all mixed up. I don't know.
Okay, we're talking Queensland.
I don't pay enough attention. I pay the right amount of attention to LNP premiers and opposition leaders.
Unfortunately, I pay a lot, but yeah.
Yeah, well, you've got to. But in Queensland...
So it could well be closed down from April there. And
have they locked that in?
They have this week just confirmed that funding won't continue beyond April, which is an extraordinary thing in a context where hundreds of people have been through that service.
It's saved lives.
It's identified many danger. We've got more and more synthetic opioids showing up in the drug supply. There have been cases where people have brought in substances that have been contaminated with nitazines. These are incredibly potent synthetic opioids. A tiny speck can be enough to cause an overdose, like 2 milligrams, like terrifying, like nothing we've seen before. And in this context, the LNP's decided no, the right thing to do is to shut the service down. Notwithstanding that it does things like brings people in who might have never talked to their GP about their drug use. There have been people who have then connected with drug treatment services because they've found out that, no, actually my drugs aren't shit. I've got a tolerance to methamphetamine or whatever it might be. And that's an avenue into connecting with the treatment provider. Like, who doesn't want that? Or who doesn't want...
A lot of people discover, they check their drugs, it's not what it said on the little baggie.
And they throw it away.
And they throw it away.
Who wouldn't want that?
Yeah, and even if you're a just say no type, well, you're reducing drug use. You're stopping people from doing that and reducing harm.
And I think that there's many people in Crucifali's government who recognise that. And I don't know that, his decision to intervene to basically shut it down is one that's necessarily popular even within his own party. I mean, we've done polling on this, on support for pill testing around the country, and a majority of Liberal voters support pill testing. It's like across the board. Even if you're a person who says, I hate drugs or drug use is wrong or whatever, the majority of those people also support pill testing. It's not it's a completely mainstream common sense issue that is like recognized as being a valuable service for people who have a vastly different range of views about drug use itself. So yeah, look, frustrating. It seems like the thing about Queensland is there's actually this regulatory, I won't go into the detail, but there's a framework around pill testing that enables the service to continue as long as it can be funded. And so now the push is to find philanthropy to fill the gap to enable that service to continue.
Was there an enacting ledge? Was there ledge that was brought in, and so they have to pull that apart? Do they?
Essentially, yeah. There is legislation and a regulatory framework that basically means that anyone who's prepared to jump through the 3,000 hoops could apply for a license to do pill testing in Queensland. So yeah.
So that's Queensland.
That's Queensland here.
And the tide goes in, the tide goes out. But that's an ongoing issue. Victoria, we've had Victoria, so tell us about Victoria.
Well, Victoria's the fast mover, the agenda setter, or like they have set the benchmark, I think, for what a pill testing trial should look like in the country. They've just started this 18-month trial that involves a dozen festivals, and then, of course, also this service in Melbourne CBD, which is similar to Brisbane, but just at a bigger scale. Better technology, more investment in technology, more opening hours, all that kind of thing. It's going to be a super impressive service when that opens. Very much looking forward to that. And, it's...
Where is that? Is that in Richmond? Where is it?
There's not a location that's been settled yet. I think it's more likely to be closer to Melbourne CBD.
Okay.
So that's Victoria. And one of the things for me that was brilliant about Victoria was seeing the Premier, Jacinta Allen, talk like when she launched pill testing there, she was on her Instagram feed and then across media talking about it in this incredibly common sense way, reflecting on her own experience as a parent and what she would want should her children decide to use drugs, that they would have that service where they'd actually get effective health advice to help them manage the risks. And it's like, what a journey, right? We've been saying this for years and years and years, and seeing it come out of the mouth of the Premier is very, very satisfying. So
it's so powerful, isn't it? Because there's only one horse in the race in any of these things. It's self-interest. And if the Premier gets up and says, it's in your interest to have this system here because your child, your sister, your aunt someone you know and love or a work colleague, this may be fundamental, essential in, reducing harm, saving their lives. Why wouldn't you want that? It's a benefit to you, which shows how pervasive and important, good drug laws are, because the issues affects essentially everyone in society.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's completely true.
And so great leadership there from Jacinta Allen in Victoria. And we see it again and again. We see a more timid and conservative New South Wales Labor government sort of looking to the ACT in parts, and also to Victoria, and saying, okay, like you go first ones into the pool. And so we've had movement in New South Wales, I think, despite some reticence from the Premier.
That's a nice way of putting it. Yeah, I think that there was definitely some reticence. And you're also right, ACT was the first mover here, and the CAN test service has been operating there in Canberra for some years now, funded right through to 2027, I think, at the moment. So that's very good to see, and also using some great technology. So like generating really precise, accurate information about drugs that they can then share with people. Here in New South Wales, it's fresh. This weekend is the first, we're here recording at the end of February. The 1st of March will be the start of pill testing in New South Wales at Yours and Ours Festival in Wollongong, which is really exciting to see. And I mean, that's a 2-month-old commitment from government. And there's just 10 festivals involved in this, or 10 to 12 festivals involved in this trial. And they've done something a little bit different from other states in that New South Wales Health itself is running the service. I believe in partnership with NUA, the New South Wales Users and AIDS Association, which runs the DanceWise program, a fantastic peer-based harm reduction service that goes out to festivals to provide people with advice. And so now they'll also be providing people with pill testing, advice based on analysing people's drugs as well. So just getting started.
And that's really powerful information, because drugs ain't drugs. Well, it isn't what's on the baggie, and we are seeing new synthetic opioids turn up in the illicit drug stream. They're either by design or by the fact that they're cut with different things, processed in the same areas, and those drugs can be incredibly dangerous and life-threatening, can't they?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we saw it even a few years back with the inquest in 2018-19 into deaths at music festivals, where it was like one of the big contributors to that was high-potency MDMA, and that's a trend that we've seen over the last decade or so. Ironically, it's maybe not ironically, maybe it's just how this works, but it's a result in part of increased law enforcement that basically knocked out saffron production in Southeast Asia. That was the major precursor to manufacture MDMA, most of which is manufactured in the Netherlands. And so then, MDMA manufacturers had to find out a different way to synthesize MDMA, and then settled on a different precursor, MPK, a wholly synthetic precursor that is produced in industrial quantities. And so then that flowed through to the production of some super high potency pills, 200, 300 milligrams, which is more than what would be regarded as an effective dose for an adult. And in addition to that, here in Australia, we have like quite high potency MDMA in crystal form as well. In a context where you've also got a lot of very low potency pills, there's this, habit practice that's emerged of double dumping and that kind of thing. And if you combine that with both high potency MDMA and then with high heat, it's a recipe for disaster. Too much MDMA makes the body heat up. And if you're in a hot environment, that can be fatal. Essentially, your organs cook inside your body.
And that's advice people get at these drug checking services, don't they? Those pill testing services. The health expert there can say, this is, if you are going to take this drug,
exactly,
and it is this is what you can look out for. That's the advice for someone who might be a naive, novel user. That's the first time they've actually had someone who's an expert tell them, this is the effect it's going to have on your body physiologically. These are the things to look out for. And this is what you do if you get into trouble.
Exactly. Yeah. And, most of the people who come to these services never spoken to a health professional about their drug use before. And also, they don't just ask them about, like, they don't just tell them about what's in the drug. They'll also ask them about their own medical history. And an example would be that, like, if you're taking SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, for anxiety or depression, that actually can interact with MDMA use, which also acts on the serotonin system. And that can be a contributor to, let's just say, having something between a shit time and going to hospital. People just generally don't have access to that information. And so sitting down, like, in a way, getting access to the results is an incentive for people to come into a service and sit down with a health professional, share their own medical history, and then get targeted advice that helps them reduce the risk based on themselves as a person and the substance that they're actually taking. Great idea, right?
Great idea. You're never going to completely eliminate risk. But you can, reduce the harm. You can undo some of those potential
like
harms.
Seatbelts or
exactly
everything else we do in society, to manage risks.
Put
Wearing
filters
life
on
jackets.
filters on cigarettes.
Well, that one's a little bit more complicated. But, high potency MDMA is one thing, but then in more recent years, we've seen more and more of these nitazines and other synthetic opioids.
Because people
up.
taking cocaine, they're not expecting to have an opiate overdose. We've seen it turn.
Might not even know what it is.
Not even know what it is, what the
signs
signs are, and you're basically having your body shut down. The complete opposite of what you would think.
Yeah.
And so we certainly, I think, we'll be better off with services that people can avail themselves of to make sure, that and having a mature discussion that, like there's literally, like, Sydney is swimming in cocaine, tons and tons of it, and the community really needs to know that there's some risks involved.
Yeah.
Even if it's relatively pure cocaine, but there's some things in there, contaminants, and things you can do to make sure make yourself safer.
Yeah. Look, just as a side point, I think that the other thing that there's a low awareness of with cocaine is just how much blood there is in the supply chain. And look, I appreciate that that's not necessarily blood.
Oh yeah, blood,
violence.
Oh, violence. Yeah.
And I appreciate that's not the fault of the consumer.
Oh my God,
Actual blood.
They're purifying it with human blood. But yeah, like,
you know what? Some of the production involves kids standing in baths of solvents, treading coca leaves to extract,
human trafficking. People are abducted and basically forced into producing, transporting. Selling these drugs, it's not without massive impacts.
Of course, and here in Australia, it's not like we have some boutique kind of like fair trade cocaine cocaine supply that comes anyway, it all comes from South America and is controlled by Mexican transnational criminal gangs who
they are the worst of the worst. These are people
responsible
for mass murder,
extraordinary,
and destabilising governments, and horrendous.
And the irony is that you go to Bondi, right, the home of yoga and bloody almond milk lattes and fair trade this and that, and here are people railing lines of coke down at the pub. Which is definitely not fair trade. It's probably the arms trade aside, it's probably the most violent industry in the world. And, I appreciate, again, it's not consumers' fault. That's obviously a product of the fact that it's illegal. But still, I think it is worth considering whether or not that's something as a consumer you want to participate in.
I think it is hilarious. Like, Parliament, it is not immune from drug use. And there's a lot of people, as a legalised cannabis MP, look at me and go, oh, you're promoting drugs and all the rest. And there has been times when I've gone into the toilet at Parliament House and looked at the top of the toilet and went, that's not talcum powder in there. There's no workplace, be it Parliament or, the Reserve Bank, that's immune from people using drugs. And so many people are using cocaine and then sort of saying, oh, well, legalisation, reducing harm, it's got nothing to do with me, just say no. And yet they're, up to their necks in it too.
It's the same. We're sitting here in the downtown area of Sydney, across the road from Macquarie Street from Parliament. And if you go to the officers of the major law firms or the financial industry, my goodness. I
Yeah.
mean, the rates of cocaine use, and not just cocaine, opiate use as well, are staggering. There's a huge number of people who work in, for example, 6-7 figure salary jobs in the finance industry who have serious problems with cocaine and other drugs. But, getting back to contaminants, it's not just cocaine that's got nitazines in it. We've seen it in all sorts of things. It's staggering. I mean, New South Wales... Synthetic vapes. There are kids who are turning up at health services here in New South Wales with opioid addictions because they've bought vapes that actually contain nitazines. And New South Wales Health themselves have issued alerts about that in the last year or so. It's turned up in illegal cannabis products. It's turned up in MDMA, caused overdoses at festivals of people who've taken MDMA, and actually contains nitazines. It's in basically all sorts of drugs right across the range, uppers, downers, everything.
The other part of the conversation around contaminants is, and you've led the campaign in this, and Noor and others, is making sure that frontline responders have the resources, have the training, have the naloxone.
Yeah.
I always struggle with that. That it's naloxone.
Yeah, that's it.
I've got it. Naloxone which is effectively the antidote to an overdose on opiates. Tell us about that campaign.
Yeah, hugely important one right now. And so naloxone, reverses the effect of opiates. It's an opioid antagonist, and it's a medication that reverses the effects of an opioid overdose. You can get naloxone from pharmacies right across the country. We've got quite a good system for accessibility of naloxone, at least in theory. The problem is most people don't know about it. And that includes people who use drugs but who just don't use opioids, which is where a lot of the focus has gone in the past in terms of building awareness about naloxone. But we need everyone who uses MDMA, coke, whatever, to be aware of the risk of overdose.
So if you're running a dance party, dance-wise, do it. If you're running a dance party, you make sure that there's someone there, that there's some on site, there's someone knows how to treat someone if they're overdosing.
Yeah.
And it does and will save lives.
Yeah, I mean, it has many, 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 many lives. Like naloxone has just, especially, for example, in the United States, where, of course, like the rate of overdose from fentanyl has just been staggering, hugely above like what we're experiencing. And I think a sign of how bad things can get if we don't actually act early to make sure that, we don't end up with a crisis on our hands. Yeah, organisations like Noor have been distributing naloxone as well as the pharmacies. But if you've actually had the experience of going into your pharmacy, it's an interesting one, like going in and asking your pharmacist for naloxone. I've had a range of, I've done it myself, and I've spoken with people who've done it. And it's not necessarily an easy or comfortable thing to do. There still is a lot of stigma around drug use and around the idea of an overdose and that kind of stuff. And then on top of that, we've got this situation now where there's a shortage of naloxone. And it's
is that a symptom of the fact that there's just such an epidemic of opiate misuse in the States?
I believe that's part of it. Yeah, it's a supply chain issue, as I understand it, and it's come at the very worst time. It's come at this time when we're seeing the emergence of more and more synthetic opioids, and so definitely something. I mean, it's kind of more a federal government responsibility to fix that one, but it's definitely something that has got to be fixed. In the US. It's even people like bus drivers. It's at the point where people like bus drivers are being equipped with naloxone, because that's where they're the people who actually come across people overdosing on buses or in public places.
And in Australia, we're just asking for the police and
the police in New South Wales are not keen on carrying naloxone. In other states, they're already carrying naloxone, but we've not quite got there yet here in New South Wales. But yeah, I mean, in the States, it's obviously, they're in a different situation in terms of the scale of the crisis, but it's got to the stage where it's well beyond the police. It's people who are sweeping the street or, whomever. If you might come across a person experiencing overdose, there's been an effort to actually make sure they've got naloxone.
Well, let's turn our attention to something you're not going to overdose on, and I've tried. unsuccessfully, and that is cannabis.
Well, you can.
Can
It's
you? Really?
It doesn't kill you.
It
It's just very unpleasant.
It's just
right?
very unpleasant. You're wide out and
Have to go to sleep.
yeah, have to go to sleep or, have a big orange juice and a violent crumble. But cannabis. Now you're putting your shoulder to the wheel in terms of the cannabis law reform space. Why are you doing that now? We really welcome it. The Legalised Cannabis Party really welcome your attention there, and you're really focusing in on Albo. Tell us why you think cannabis law reform's overdue and what you're doing about it.
One of the things that's been really encouraging is seeing this steady growth in support for cannabis legalisation in Australia. About bit over half of all Australians think that we should legalise, tax and regulate cannabis, and that's been tracking like that same upward trajectory and public support that we saw in the States, but maybe 10 to 15 years behind. But it's a very positive story. I think people, including because they've seen medical cannabis, are shifting their attitude toward cannabis to be less afraid of it and to understand that actually there are ways that you can manage the substance better than just banning it. So that's a really positive trend. And without seeing that, I think we have to look for areas where there is that public support, where there's that opportunity to actually engage members of the public, in basically accelerating or supporting them on a path that they're already on. So that's the sign to get involved for us. And in addition to that, of course...
Well, I mean, what I'm reading into that is you can get an outcome. You're not going from zero... This is about getting an outcome, getting something done sooner rather than later.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we want to run the campaigns that are winnable.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, cannabis accounts for about 75,000 arrests every year across Australia. It's the main substance that people are arrested for. And as you probably know, the majority of those arrests are just personal amount. It's someone getting busted with a couple of joints, a small quantity of cannabis. So,
and they're more likely than not to be younger people. They're more likely to be black. They're more likely to be in a low, socioeconomic area. There's not thousands and thousands of, surfers up on the northern beaches or, middle class kids. It's actually, targeted and discriminatory policing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's rock solid data for that, some of which we got from New South Wales Police under Freedom of Information last year. Basically, if you're Aboriginal, for example, the police are 5 times more likely to bust you for a personal cannabis offence.
And you're less likely to have the cautioning scheme available to you.
Oh, yeah, and you're no more likely to be using cannabis anyway. It's not the fact that it's not that Aboriginal people are using cannabis greatly more than anyone else. It's that the attention of law enforcement is just directed towards particular kinds of people.
I think one of the most alarming things when you look at the data is it's one of the first reasons that the police have cause to interact with Indigenous Australians who are overrepresented in our jails, and that then leads to other charges, other dysfunction. The police say, we think you might have cannabis and it might just be a personal amount. I'm going to search you. Someone tells the police officer to get fucked. Then all of a sudden there's other charges are resisting and escalates.
Definitely.
And then you have young people, and that's the most concerning part, caught in the gears of the criminal justice system who needlessly.
Yeah, and of course, having had that experience, then you're more likely to end up in the same position. You don't qualify for our diversion schemes here in New South Wales if you've got prior offences, and so basically it's just the frequent flyer rewards program that just keeps you just cycling through the justice system, because the more the more that you are in contact with the police, the more charges you receive, the more
the police see you next time, they target
spirals.
you, search you in the car again, and it's just spirals down.
It's also a really easy drug to find. It's smelly, so a lot of the drug detection dog operations that we have here in New South Wales, a lot of what they find are people with small quantities of cannabis. And so, it's young people, it's just people who catch the train, basically it's the primary cause of criminalisation of people for drug use in this country. And like you say, it's hugely harmful. It affects people's job opportunities, their ability to study, it affects their relationships, all kinds of things. And, for that reason, it's an opportunity to basically reduce the impact of the criminal justice system on the community. And I think, cannabis is not the only law that I think we need to move out of the, criminal justice framework, but it is the best opportunity to make the biggest impact through one single drug law reform.
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with you there, Will. One of the things that you've just touched on is how police. And in New South Wales in particular, we have a pretty proactive police force getting out there with sniffer dogs, and they're actually policing kids. One of your big campaigns is stopping, and some people, unless they've seen it or they wouldn't have believed it's happening, the police have the power and they do go out there and strip search children on the basis that they may have a small quantity or a quantity of drugs. It's extraordinary. Why are the police doing it? I know the Redfern Legal Centre is all over this. We've talked about it, privately, and we're campaigning on it. But why are the police doing it?
Look,
and what are the harms?
I don't know why the police are doing it. I can't answer that. Can't speak. It seems indefensible, right? I mean, and it's not happening at a small scale. I think there've been over 1,000 incidents where a child's been strip searched in New South Wales in the last decade. It's just staggering, and I think
some of them are found not to have had drugs.
Of course, yeah, of course. And
so if you have a suspicion, the police believe that there's a reasonable suspicion, or you have a drug sniffer dog sits down next to you, you gear off.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a hugely distressing experience for people. I've not experienced myself, but I've certainly talked and worked with a lot of people who have, and especially not only, but in particular for people who've experienced sexual assault, it's an incredibly traumatizing experience. And I mean, the sense of disempowerment of being taken by a police officer when you're, in a public place, or you're just on the train, or you're just going to a music festival with your mates, looking forward to having a good time. Next minute, there you are, butt naked, being told to sit, to squat and cough by a cop standing over you, searching all your stuff for drugs. Hugely distressing. It happens at music festivals, of course. Mardi Gras will be on this weekend. Police have a history of really intensively policing that event. They'll have the tent there. They'll be stripping people naked yet again. It's just shocking. And what I find is that when I talk to people about it, particularly the fact that children are being strip searched, people get it. That's not cool. You don't really have to go into the arguments and whatnot. They understand that that's strip searching children is not a good thing to be doing. And it's certainly something that we would like to see an end to here in New South Wales.
I put that argument this is indefensible. It's barbaric to the Attorney General, Mick Daly, just to make sure the media monitors pick that up. And he said, if we don't do this, then the crime gangs, organised crime, will use children to transport drugs, which I thought was just a ridiculous argument when you consider the harm, the likelihood that the common cheros are going to get a whole heap of street urchins to move around commercial quantities of drugs. It's just indefensible.
I mean, and it's just an example of how these kind of baseless speculation about what might happen is used to justify these hugely harmful practices, and then there's no kind of requirement to actually back up the idea that, the common chero is going to be running drugs with 12-year-olds. Based on what? It's just, it's just bullshitting.
It sure is. Well, look, you are a guy, Will, I can say, that is not bullshitting. You've based your career, your work on the facts, a rational, researched approach to a complex and often difficult area of public policy because there's so much hysteria involved. But you've really done a great job, mate, of pulling that apart, you and your organisation. So a massively effective campaigner. Everyone out there who cares about drug law reform should really have a look at the work that Unharm's done. I really appreciate it. The work on pill testing, drug checking, cannabis, on strip searching really powerful campaigns, and I'm sure you're going to win them in the future. I really appreciate the work you've done, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come in and get into the weeds, mate.
Thank you. It's been great. I really appreciate it too, and really looking forward to making some noise and getting some movement on cannabis law reform in the years ahead.
I think we will, mate. It's inevitable, it's inexorable, and with your help, we'll get it done. Well, everyone, thanks very much for tuning in. Check out the work that Unharm does. It's really, really important. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. See you next time on Into the Weeds.